Autumn 1943. The morning sky over western Germany is pale and bitterly cold. At 25,000 feet, a formation of silver shapes glints in the sun, their engines roaring in perfect unison. Each is a Boeing B-17 flying fortress, lumbering yet majestic, a moving fortress of aluminum and fire. Inside, the airmen are silent behind oxygen masks, eyes raw from the sting of frost and fear. Their breath turns to crystals against the glass. Far ahead, black flak blooms across the horizon, expanding flowers of death. In the distance, German fighters climb through the haze, sunlight catching the black crosses on their wings. They've been here before. They've left before. To them, these American bombers are too slow, too heavy, too obvious, a perfect target. But as they close in, the laughter fades beneath the thunder of 50 caliber guns. From every window, from every turret, comes a storm of lead, tracers tearing the sky like burning needles. The formation does not scatter. It holds. It endures. And for the first time, Luftwaffe pilots begin to realize, this isn't a raid. It's a fortress in flight. The sky itself has changed. Long before the German aces saw their laughter fade above Europe, the story of the flying fortress began far from battle, in Seattle, Washington. In 1934, Boeing engineers stared at blueprints that seemed impossible. A four-engine bomber that could carry a ton of explosives farther and higher than anything before it. It was the middle of the Great Depression, yet America's skies were alive with ambition. When the prototype first lifted from Boeing Field in July 1935, its immense frame and turreted guns drew gasps from reporters. One journalist called it a flying fortress, and the name never left. To the men designing it, the B-17 was more than an aircraft. It was a statement. It embodied a belief that American industry could build security through precision and endurance, not speed or fury. By 1941, as the world spiraled into war, that belief found its test. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe had crushed cities and nations. Britain's night bombers struck back in darkness, relying on safety through shadows. But the Americans arrived with a radical conviction. They would bomb by day, in formation, in plain view of the enemy. The U.S. Army Air Forces believed daylight precision could cripple German industry, hitting ball-bearing plants, fuel refineries, and aircraft factories. The B-17, bristling with up to 1350 caliber machine guns, would protect itself and its neighbors. Through sheer defensive firepower, it was a theory, born of faith in machines and men, a faith untested against the reality of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. By late 1942, the first American formations crossed the English Channel. Their crews, young, nervous, and far from home, believed in the fortress's promise. The Germans, watching from the ground and from their cockpits, saw something different. A slow, arrogant machine, trying to challenge the hunters of Europe. For a moment, confidence belonged to the Luftwaffe. But war has a way of testing confidence, one formation at a time. By 1943, the skies above Europe had become a second front, a shifting battlefield of contrails and thunder. The Luftwaffe ruled it with practiced confidence. Its pilots were veterans of Spain, Poland, and France, men like Adolf Galland and Walter Dahl, aces who had survived hundreds of sorties. They had grown used to dominance, to the idea that nothing could withstand a head-on attack from German precision and discipline. When reports first arrived that the Americans would bomb in daylight, the reaction in Luftwaffe briefings was disbelief, even amusement. The British had already tried and failed. The night had become their only protection. Yet here were the Americans, announcing they would fly in straight lines, under the sun, at high altitude, through the very range of German guns. A suicide tactic, some called it. But as the first formations of B-17s appeared over occupied France and the Ruhr, something unusual emerged. The bombers didn't scatter when attacked. Their defensive formation, staggered boxes of 12 or more, created a sphere of interlocking fire. To reach one bomber, a fighter had to face the guns of several. Still, the early raids were costly. American crews paid for every mission in lives and engines. The long distances to targets like Bremen and Wilhelmshaven meant hours of exposure. Without long-range escorts, the B-17s were on their own. Many never returned to their airfields in Norfolk and Suffolk. Yet despite the losses, more came. Every week the formations grew. Tighter, stronger, more disciplined. New groups arrived from the States. Fresh-faced crews who carried the same belief. Precision could win the war. The Luftwaffe began to notice something deeper. The rhythm of replacement. The industrial pulse behind the silver wings. For every fortress lost, another two seemed to appear. Beneath that hum of engines, Germany began to hear a different kind of sound. Not just machines, but the echo of a nation that could outlast fear. And soon, that sound would fill the sky. At the heart of the B-17's legend was its deliberate design. A bomber that carried not just bombs, but belief. Every inch of its frame spoke to a different philosophy of warfare. The idea that endurance was strength. Unlike the fast, sleek German interceptors built for quick kills, the B-17 was built for survival. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines powered the massive wings, each one capable of keeping the aircraft aloft even if another failed or burned. Armor plating shielded the cockpit and vital systems, while self-sealing fuel tanks gave crews a precious margin of life when shells tore through the fuselage. But the real innovation was not in steel. It was in geometry. American tacticians at the 8th Air Force perfected a formation called the combat box. Each bomber occupied a calculated space within a 3-dimensional grid, its arcs of fire overlapping with its neighbors. A single fortress could direct as many as 13 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns. Nose, chin, waist, tail, and dorsal turrets all coordinated into a single, living weapon. When dozens of aircraft flew together, those guns created an invisible dome of lead. German pilots soon learned the cost of entering that dome. Attacks from the rear, once routine, became deadly. The tail gunners, often among the youngest aboard, learned to measure distance not by sight, but by the flash of tracers. Every 5th round glowed in flight, marking a wall of molten light through which the Luftwaffe had to fly. The sound of those Brownings, sharp, relentless, mechanical, became the voice of the fortress itself. American engineers had chosen the 50 caliber deliberately. It was heavier than anything mounted on other bombers, a weapon that could tear through armored fuselages and ignite engines. What began as a technical specification became a symbol of American design, power balanced by precision. The German pilots who first mocked the bulky B-17 soon found their gun cameras filled with blinding flashes instead of clean kills. The fortress did not turn quickly, but it did not need to. Its defense was cooperation, a network of men and machines bound by discipline and mathematics. And within that design lay the quiet revolution that would redefine air warfare. Victory not through agility, but through unity. Inside the fortress, war felt both endless and intimate. The crew of 10 men functioned like a single living organism: navigator, bombardier, pilot, co-pilot, engineer, gunners. Each depended entirely on the others, sealed within an aluminum shell where temperature could plunge below -40 degrees. Oxygen hissed through frozen masks. Sweat froze inside gloves. Between the roar of engines and the rattle of guns, communication was reduced to nods and instinct. To the Germans who once joked about American arrogance, the sight of those formations began to carry a different meaning. Pilots reported that the bombers would not break, even when burning. They watched crews hold formation while flames licked across the wings, refusing to leave the line. Some Luftwaffe veterans later admitted a grudging respect and fear for the men who flew the fortress. For the Americans, the sound of the engines became more than mechanical. It was a heartbeat. When one engine faltered, others carried the weight. When one bomber fell, the formation closed the gap. That steady drone, 4 engines multiplied by hundreds, was the sound of endurance, of democracy expressed in metal. Every man aboard the B-17 learned that survival came not from strength alone, but from trust. And as German fighters began to fall in greater numbers, the sky itself seemed to whisper the lesson. Unity, not pride, would rule the air. August 17, 1943. The morning began in silence across English airfields. Mechanics checked fuel lines and oxygen valves. Crews strapped on flak jackets still cold from the night dew. The target, two of Germany's most vital industrial centers, Regensburg's Messerschmitt factories and Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. Without those bearings, German tanks and aircraft would grind to a halt. It was to be the largest daylight bombing assault yet attempted. Hundreds of B-17s flying deep into Bavaria without fighter escort. As the first formations crossed the channel, German radar stations lit up. Fighters scrambled from every direction. Over the next hours, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had. Bf-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine Zerstörers armed with rockets. The sky filled with black bursts and streaking contrails. The air around the bombers turned to fire. Fortress after fortress took hits, engines burning, wings torn open. Yet the formation held. Gunners fired until barrels smoked. In gun cameras recovered later, German pilots' approaches ended in sudden flashes of .50 caliber fury. Some called it flying into a storm of iron. When the surviving crews finally returned that night, their faces were gray with exhaustion and disbelief. 60 bombers were lost. Thousands of lives hung on what they had proven. The fortress could survive, and it could strike deep into the heart of Germany. As the smoke cleared over Schweinfurt, German ground crews stared upward at a sky that still trembled with the echo of engines. The factories burned, machinery twisted under molten roofs, and yet, incredibly, some bombers had turned for home, wounded but alive. Witnesses on the ground described the sight of damaged fortresses limping westward, smoke trailing for miles, their tails shredded but their formation unbroken. One Luftwaffe pilot, later captured, admitted the shock. "They just kept coming," he said in interrogation. "We thought no man could fly through that much fire and stay in line." The joke that had once echoed in airfields, that the flying fortress was too slow to fight, had turned to quiet respect. Every surviving German fighter carried bullet holes, torn wings, or wounded men. For the Americans, the price was unbearable, yet something deeper had been won: psychological airspace. From that day, Luftwaffe strategists began to recognize the impossible truth. Even their best could not destroy enough fortresses to halt the assault. American bombers would keep coming, carried not by invincibility, but by the will of a nation that refused to stop. And above all, the rhythmic hum of 4 engines became a sound no German soldier could ignore. The sound of inevitability itself. In the days that followed, Allied command rooms fell silent as the numbers came in. Of the 376 B-17s that left England that morning, 60 never returned. 600 airmen were dead or missing. It was one of the bloodiest days in the history of the 8th Air Force. Yet despite the losses, the mission achieved what no Allied raid had done before. It struck the German war machine at its heart, forcing factories to halt production for weeks. In Berlin, the results spread fear through industry reports. Schweinfurt's bearings, once a symbol of mechanical perfection, now represented fragility. German planners realized that no distance inside their borders was beyond reach. For the first time, civilians saw daylight bombing not as a passing threat, but as a shadow that could fall at any hour. And though victory came at a terrible cost, the B-17 had proven its name true. It was not indestructible, but it was unstoppable. While the Luftwaffe celebrated a tactical success, the larger picture told a different story. Within weeks, new B-17s rolled off American assembly lines in Seattle and Long Beach, faster than Germany could replace a single lost fighter. Crews trained in Colorado and Texas stepped into brand-new aircraft as though the losses had been anticipated. It was the visible strength of a nation whose factories had become an extension of the battlefield. German intelligence reports began to note a disturbing trend. Despite heavy attrition, the number of flying fortresses over Europe kept increasing. Even as fuel shortages and spare part crises gripped the Reich, the Americans seemed immune to exhaustion. For every bomber destroyed, another rose to take its place. An endless rhythm of engines crossing the channel. To Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed at American optimism, the sound of those engines became haunting. It was not just the roar of metal. It was the sound of a continent waking to the reality of American power. When historians look back on the air war over Europe, they often measure it in tonnage and loss, in engines and altitude. But behind the statistics was a simple truth. The Flying Fortress was not merely a machine. It was a message. Every mission that crossed the channel carried more than bombs. It carried the hum of a nation that believed endurance could outlast fear. In its aluminum skin and riveted seams lived the rhythm of American democracy. Imperfect, loud, and stubbornly persistent. Each 50 caliber gun that fired into the sky did so not in vengeance, but in defiance of silence. It spoke for every man who flew knowing he might not return, and for every hand that built these aircraft in the heart of an industrial awakening. For the Germans, the laughter that once followed the fortress became memory, replaced by the uneasy realization that no fortress stood taller than will itself. Even when fortresses fell, they fell in formation, holding the line until the end. That image, wounded bombers flying home, engines coughing against the wind, became one of the war's quiet miracles. In the years that followed, the B-17 would fade from the skies, its role taken by faster jets and newer machines. But its echo never left. Veterans still recall that low, thunderous hum, 4 engines synchronized in perfect labor, a sound that seemed to hold the promise of endurance itself. It was the sound of factories and fields, of youth and fear, of sacrifice woven into metal. It was the voice of a country discovering its strength not in conquest, but in the courage to keep flying straight through the storm. And long after the guns fell silent, the sky over Europe still remembers that sound, the heartbeat of the Flying Fortress, and the long, steady echo of freedom.